Hello and welcome to today's Learning Byte. My name is Scott Newman, and today we're going to be talking about understanding fabric nodes within Junos Space. Fabric nodes basically are the concept of what you might understand as clustering. In other words, putting two or more nodes or space devices into a cluster, or in this case, we call it a fabric. In fact, you can have as many as just a single space node, and that would still be considered a space fabric. There's just one node in the fabric, and you can actually have up to 10 nodes in the fabric performing a variety of functions. So we're going to talk about that here today. And then, so part one of this, we'll just kind of describe how that works, how the fabrics work, or how the nodes work within a space fabric. And then we'll actually do just a short little demo. We'll actually add a third node to an existing two-node fabric. So let's first take a look at how the space nodes work. And again, we're kind of giving you the elevator pitch here. In other words, just a brief overview of how many nodes you can have. So this is one of the questions, though, that people often ask. Here we have our space fabric. In this case, we have node 1 is the only node in the fabric, so we're still considered a fabric. If you were to go into the UI of the space node, you would see in the fabric settings, you would just see the one node, and the one node basically performs everything. So in a small environment, it makes sense, right? You don't need to have a ton of devices to manage if you've just got, a handful of Junos devices that you're managing through space. So in this situation, even though it's not necessarily pictured here, you're going to see in a minute how this works. The single node is performing everything: the network monitoring, or FMPM, fault monitoring and performance monitoring, application logic, which is basically the under the hood capabilities of how it's managing the devices, the database functionality, and the load balancing. Obviously, the load balancing isn't really taking place in this case because there's just the single fabric. The load balancing takes place when you have two or more space nodes. Now in this case, we've added all our functionality here except for FMPM. It's not noted, but it would also technically be included here. Node 1 and Node 2 are performing load balancing, the database functionality, and the application logic, as well as the network monitoring. It's all occurring on these two nodes. It's important to understand that when you're dealing with the space fabric, you only have two nodes performing the load balancing. If you have any more nodes than that, they're not doing any of the load balancing. In other words, access from end users or trying to access the system. Okay, the load balancing is only taking place between node 1 and node 2. Now at this point, we're getting a little more complicated. Now we've added up to 6 nodes in our fabric. Now we used to say that was the maximum that you could have. Now we say we can add up to 10. But you'll notice that nodes 3, 4, 5, and 6 are not doing any of the database work. They're not doing any of the load balancing. Their only function is to be what we would call JBoss, or application logic nodes. Okay, so again, node 1 and 2 are doing load balancing. They're also serving as app logic nodes, and they're also serving as database nodes. Now we're starting to manage a lot of devices. We're finding that the overhead is a little too much here. So what can we do? We could actually add, and you could do this, by the way, in any number of nodes. You could have dedicated database nodes, which is what we have here. So now we've added 2 more nodes. Their sole purpose is to serve as database nodes. Now you could do this with any fewer number. You don't necessarily have to have 8 nodes to have dedicated database nodes, but there they are. And then finally, you could add 2 dedicated FMPM nodes. So you could add any number of combination here to the number of nodes that you have. So if you wanted to have, maybe you just have a 3-node cluster, which is the example we'll show you in a minute, where we have nodes 1 and 2 serving as the load balancer and application logic. Then you have, and then in this serial, they would also be the database nodes. And then you have a third node serving as an FMPM node. Or, so there's a lot of different examples here that you could look at. Now this is the maximum number that you could possibly have, so of course it's a little bit complicated the way it's set up here. And it's probably a little confusing to look at, but I try to make it as straightforward as I possibly can. There is one exception where you could have perhaps even 12 space nodes in the fabric. But those additional 2 nodes would be serving specific purposes. You could have a log collector node, and you could have a security or a policy enforcer node. So those are the 2 nodes that you can have, a log collector node and a policy enforcer node. Of course, those are specialized nodes. They're doing something very specific there. They're not necessarily a part of the network management platform in that case. So they're technically not a part of the fabric, but they are a part of the fabric, at least for the case that we're looking at. So let's take a closer look at how we would actually configure this. And again, we're taking the sort of the mile-high overview here of how it works. So if we open up our environment, you'll notice that I already have a fabric configured. If I go into the network management platform and I navigate to administration fabric, I've got 2 nodes already set up. They're configured to be in a cluster or in a fabric. And node 1 is up and is the master, and node 2 is also up. Now, there are a lot of different scenarios here that we don't have time to talk about where, okay, well, what happens if space 1 goes down? Space 2 basically automatically takes over the VIP or the virtual IP address. So the virtual IP address in this case is 172.25.11.100, and it's not necessarily shown here. These are the node addresses, but if I navigate to 172.25.11.100, it's going to take me to the active node. Okay, so now we want to add a third node to the fabric. So I've got a third node here, and this is going to be a specialized FMPM or fault monitoring and performance monitoring node. So the main purpose of the FMPM node is going to be for network monitoring. Okay, so this is a brand new installation. So we're going to go ahead and log in here for the first time. We use the default credentials. The username is admin. The default password is ABC123, but I'm going to need to change that right away. So I go ahead and do that. First I got to enter my original password again. Now I got to type in the new password. So it needs to be a little bit more complicated. So we're going to, just for the sake of the demo, we're going to call it lab123 and then a capital LAB. Okay, so I go ahead and do that. That worked okay. So again, I've got to type in my password. We'll do it again. This is the new password I just made. And you'll notice it takes a few minutes, and we'll pause the recording here so that we're not consistently waiting with silence as we wait for this to come up, because otherwise it'll take a few minutes. It takes probably about 10 minutes normally for a node to add to the fabric. So of course we don't want to just sit there and wait. So we'll pause that part when we get to it. Okay. So we are going to select, actually, notice that it defaults to the space platform, which is not what we want in this case. We want to choose FMPM. So we're going to choose FMPM. We're going to configure the IP address, and we're going to just make sure it has to be on the same subnet as the others. And we'll go ahead and specify an IP here and a mask. And of course, all of this information is going to be unique to your environment. We're going to put in a name server here. Okay, so in this case, we're going to make this the primary or the first FMPM node in an HA pair. Of course, we could add a second FMPM node, and then the second one would be the backup. But in this case, we're going to add this as the primary. So we're going to add a IP address for the FMPM service. So we're going to go ahead and do that now. And we'll just keep going up the scale here. We'll say no for NAT service because we don't need it in this case. NTP server, we'll say yes. Now in this case, our gateway is also serving as the NTP server. This would also be unique to each environment, obviously. So at this point, it's important that we go through and just make sure that everything is configured the way we want it to be. In this case, it is. So we'll go ahead and apply the settings the way we want. Now this is going to take just a few minutes, so I'm going to go ahead, while this is booting up, you want to give it some time here. You don't want to go immediately over to the desktop and try to add it because it won't work yet, because it's going to take just a few minutes for this to work. So we're going to go ahead and pause the recording, and then when we come back, it should be ready to add. Okay, so we've waited about 5 minutes or so, and looks like the node has booted up and it's back up ready to go. At this point, what we would do, we're going to skip this part because we don't necessarily need to for the demo, and it's just, but normally what you would do at this point in a production environment is you would want to expand the VM hard drive size to give more dedicated space, especially if we're, in this case, we're using a virtual machine. So we want to make sure that we have enough space there to use for data collection on this node, but we're not going to do that here. For more information on that, you can see the Juniper website. So at this point, let's go ahead and switch back over to our GUI, our desktop, where we're running the GUI, and we'll want to go ahead and add a node. Now, if you've done this before with the other space node, it's pretty straightforward. You're just going to go in and add the node. But this time, instead of adding a JBoss node like we would normally, if we were just adding a second node, or third node or whatever as part of the cluster, we're going to choose specialized node, which is what we use for the FMPM node. So we could call this whatever we want. We'll call this FMPM node, call it. And this is the funny thing. Sometimes they'll let you use spaces, sometimes they won't. In that case, they didn't want us to use a space. So we'll go ahead and type in the IP address of the node. Now, the admin credentials that you're going to use here is the admin username and password that you specified previously. So we're going to specify admin, and remember the password was lab123 capital L AB. So that's it. That's all I have to do. Now at this point we could go ahead and schedule it for a later time if we want to do this at night, in the evening, whatever. But in this case we're going to go ahead and just click add to do it right now. Now, usually this does take about, like I said, about 10 minutes, give or take. It's 10, it varies slightly, and it's going to vary wildly depending on how much memory you allocated to your virtual machine. You'll find out soon enough, if you have not allocated enough memory to your virtual machine, it's going to take a very, very long time and perhaps fail out entirely. So always make sure you have the recommended memory and usage there when doing these kinds of activities. I found when I was first starting to play with Junos Space virtual machines that when I initially started, I want to try and limit the amount of memory I was using just to see what I could get away with. And so I was using 16 gig of memory instead of the recommended 32. And when I was using space as a primary node, in other words, not as a part of a fabric at all, it worked just fine. When I started adding additional nodes to fabric, everything stopped working like it was supposed to. So at this point, like I said, it'll take about 10 minutes. We'll go ahead and pause the recording again, and we'll come back when it's ready to go. Okay, we're back. So it has been a little bit longer than the 10 minutes that I suggested. It did take about 10 minutes, or maybe even a little bit less, only about 7 or 8 minutes, for that FMPM node to complete. You'll remember we left previously on that slide. But then one of the issues, so this is kind of a good teaching moment here as well, one of the issues I had is that the FMPM node showed up here on the list of nodes in the fabric, but the status was unknown, and it's essentially app logic was also listed as unknown. Now you'll see here it's actually set to up and it's at FMPM master, which is exactly what we want. But for some reason it was kind of stuck in that unknown state. So what I ended up doing is I just rebooted all 3 nodes, and when they came up, all 3 of them came up as up and as master. So that's a trick. Now obviously it's not ideal, and it's in a production environment is certainly not what you want, because really the reality here is that you're supposed to have zero downtime when this happens. But again, it could be a result in my VM environment where it wasn't functioning properly. So at any rate, everything's up now and it's working the way we should be. So at this point, Space 1 and Space 2 will be serving essentially as app logic, database nodes, and as load balancing nodes. But then the third node is a specialized node that will be serving as the FMPM master. Now at this point, I could add a 4th node and have it be the FMPM backup, but I could only do 2. Okay, I could have 2 isolated or dedicated database nodes, and then I could add additional nodes, but they would all be serving as app logic nodes at that point. So that's it for this Learning Byte. I hope you've enjoyed it. Now, we'll be talking about a lot of this in the Junos Space Essentials course. It's a 3-day class. You can join that class. You can take it either not necessarily on demand, but in a from working from home environment, or you can take it in a classroom environment. You can go either way there, and you'll learn a lot more about fabrics and all kinds of things. If you're just getting started with Junos Space, it's a great class. So thanks a lot for joining me, and we'll catch you next time.
Visit the Juniper Education Services website to learn more about courses. View our full range of classroom, online, and e-learning courses. Learning paths, industry segment and technology-specific training paths. Juniper Network's certification program, the ultimate demonstration of your competence. And the training community, from forums to social media. Join the discussion.